Thanks a lot, Bhavna. It's a pleasure to be here. And I had the pleasure of listening into the last few minutes of the last presentation, which is a good segue in terms of what I'm going to discuss. So first of all, thank you very much. So good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are in this virtual world. My name is Munir Ferozi. I look after IFC's PPP transaction advisory business for Middle East and North Africa region. IFC is part of the World Bank Group, and we are the private sector arm of the World Bank Group. The business that I cover is providing transaction advisory services to our public sector clients, where a government may be looking to build an infrastructure and looking to get the private sector participation in that. So the topic is very, very crucial in my opinion. I think the way I look at it, risk allocation is a make or break thing for any particular project, right? And I'm going to go through this. It's a pretty rich presentation. So let me try and share the screen first. I hope you can all see that. I'm going to try and do this fairly quickly given the amount of time allocated. However, the presentation hopefully will be available, and I'll be available also for any subsequent questions. So let me go through what I want to discuss today. First of all, let's agree on a definition of risk in PPPs. Then we identify what are the risks which are usually there in terms of a PPP project. How do we allocate those risks? What are the types of those risks? And then I'll try to conclude by a live example through a very flagship PPP project that IFC structured about a decade ago, which is Madinah Airport in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Very successful project. I'll give you a bit of background, the risk, and maybe I'll share the risk matrix with you a little bit. So let me go straight into this. What is a risk? You know, a risk is, for me, is a variable factor, an unpredictable variable factor in a project's value, right? From any stakeholder's point of view, arising from another risk factor, an underlying risk factor. And I think the PPP 101 for me really is each risk should be allocated to the party which is best suited to manage this risk. This is the principle of risk allocation, and I will try to demonstrate that in the next few slides, how it's important to do that and why it's important to do that. So first of all, in PPPs, what we do is we identify and allocate all the risks through a risk register, right? So we take we enumerate all the risks, and then we basically say, okay, what are these risks? How are they associated, and how should we allocate them? And they vary obviously depending on the type of the project and the type of the country, right? Sometimes they are grouped into the risk categories in terms of particular functions. So what are the construction risks? What is the operation risk? What's the demand risk? In the project lifecycle, which is the construction, operations, etc. I'll talk a little bit about the demand risk over here. Is the risk that the project value and the revenues will be lower and higher than predicted, depending on the structuring of the project or depending on the risk appetite. So let's go through the allocation of the risk. Three key principles, you know, how to allocate risk. You should allocate it to the party which is best able to control the likelihood of the risk. Then you should be best able to control the impact of the risk on project outcomes by assessing and anticipating that risk. And then you should be able to allocate to the party who is able to mitigate this risk at the lowest cost possible. One of the tendencies I have seen in advising our government clients is to allocate a lot more risk, or at least try to allocate a lot more risks on the private sector. So two things can happen. One of them is actually, you know, each risk is priced, and the pricing could be much higher for the private sector than the public sector. In, let's say, for instance, a land contamination risk. That risk or a pre-existing condition risk should be taken up by the public sector. If you try to appropriate that to a private sector, they will put a risk premium. They will try to have a contingency around it, and the cost of that will be quite high, right? So three key principles, you know, allocated to the party best able to control, allocated to the party which is best able to control the impact, and allocated to the party which is able to do this at the least cost possible. So this is a very busy slide. And I think what I wanted to do over here was to give you a feel for a risk register in any PPP project, and this is not a all-encompassing one, but these are the major risks. On the left-hand side, there are 14 risks identified. That's a risk register, right? Essentially. And then I think on the right-hand side, as you go through the columns, you will see there are some risks which are allocated to the public sector. There are some risks which are more appropriate for the private sector. And there are some risks which are shared. And then some risks are circumstance-dependent risks. So let's talk about a couple of risks on each, or one of the risks for each of the parties. So public risk. I think the land availability, as I said, or a site risk is a public risk. Usually it's taken up by the government because they are the ones who are providing that site for a particular asset, or the political risk is completely in the control of the government. That's allocated to the public sector. And I'll go through an example of that later on. Now, as far as the construction and operations risks are concerned, this is much more controlled by the private party, usually allocated to the private party. And then there are some shared risks, for instance, a force majeure, an event happening that is neither in the control of the public sector nor in the control of the private sector. That's a shared risk, unless it's also can be insured. For example, if you have floods, right, that is an insurable risk. And if you can insure that, usually it is allocated to the private sector. However, there are some risks that are not controllable. You can take an example of what happened recently in COVID. Nobody knew, neither the public sector nor the private sector, nobody knew how to allocate it. Usually that's a force majeure risk, which is shared. Let's now quickly go on to Madinah Airport. As I mentioned in my opening remarks, this is a project we structured about a decade ago. It's a flagship project. It attracted a lot of private interest. It was the second airport in the MENA region, full airport that was done on a public-private partnership. The first one was Queen Alia Airport, which we also structured. And I think this is a project which came into the time when the IWPP market was the only market in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And IWPP market is basically based on a take or pay kind of a contract, whereas Madinah was able to shift the traffic risk to the private sector. So let's go through a little bit in terms of what it was. The project was, the government of Saudi Arabia was looking to expand the existing airport. It was a very small airport. It was processing pilgrims essentially, but it was constrained by capacity. So the first phase of the project to build an 8 million passenger terminal with a targeted capacity in phase 2, depending on the expansion, depending on the traffic growth of up to 14 million, right? The responsibility of generating and collecting all the aeronautical and non-aeronautical revenue streams was also passed on the private sector. The private sector was asked to do the construction, operations, and maintenance of the airport. The government's role was provide essential security services, provide the concession as a grantor, and making sure that the bankability of the project was protected through some of the risks that I'm going to talk about. What were the objectives of the government? So I think the first and foremost objective was to basically have an airport that it was sized according to the growing demand in the kingdom, right? They wanted to promote Medina as an entry-exit hub. So usually, when you go for Umrah or Hajj, you basically would like to go to Mecca as well as Medina. For Mecca, you have Jeddah Airport. For Medina, you have the Medina Airport. However, people usually wanted to go into one city and get out of the other city. And Medina was constrained because it didn't have that capacity available in the airport. Of course, they wanted to engage the private sector to get the best international practices, as well as one of the objectives was to generate revenues. The result, which we were very, very pleased with, was a 25-year BOT structure for a full airport concession. For every dollar that the real that the government of Saudi Arabia made, the private sector made, 54.5% was passed on to the government of Saudi Arabia. So gross revenue share of 54.5%. It was awarded to a consortium, which is also quite a sophisticated and experienced consortium of Turkish airports, Al Raji Holding, which is a major player in the kingdom, as well as Ojer. There was other bidders as well, including Paris, and Fraport. It mobilized about $1.3 billion in private investment. And I think the other important thing, which is a reason why IFC also gets engaged, is the sustainability of the design, the sustainability of the airport. It's the first airport at that time which was LEED Gold certified outside of the USA. Moving on to some of the risks that we identified in our risk register, and this is not a exhaustive list. These are the main risks that we identified. First and foremost, political risk. Secondly, regulatory risk. Mostly this is controlled by the public sector. Then you have the demand risk, which, as I said, we passed on to the private sector. The investment risk, which is the duration of the contract, and you recover your capex. The revenue risk, which is basically, are you able to collect the aeronautical and non-aeronautical revenues and are they sufficient enough to justify the capital investment? The operations risk are the output specifications and the KPIs in line with how you can operate this airport. And then the force majeure risk. What happens if an unexpected event? And it is currently going through an unexpected event, which is COVID-19. Let's look at some of these risks in a little bit more detail. So first and foremost is the political risk. Political risk is the risk of operating in a particular country. Do you have a stable economic and political environment? And in the case of Kingdom Saudi Arabia, they already had a good, strong track record in water and power sectors. Investors were comfortable investing, $1.2, $1.3 billion, as I said, in terms of this airport. So from that perspective, it was a good candidate for PPPs because the political risk appetite was there. The second is the regulatory risk. In case of Madinah, there are three things in that. Are the amount of revenues required enough to amortize the capital investment that you're going to do? Will you be allowed to do the fee collection from airlines and the users of the airport? Because sometimes they are constrained within the regulations. And what are the potential for commercial activities at the airport? And are you allowed to expand that as well? A couple of things on that. I think it got the support from the highest level. So first of all, a royal approval through the royal court was obtained by the granting authority, which is General Authority of Civil Aviation, to undertake the expansion of this airport through a private sector participation. And the second, which was a subsequent approval, which was obtained after we structured the transaction and before we went into the market, was through the Supreme Economic Council, which is a top economic regulator at that time in the country, prior to launching, as I said, the RFP or the tender. The third risk, as I said, is demand risk. What is the certainty around the passenger volume, right? Will the visa policy allow these passengers to actually come to the airport? Because the number of visas are restricted in terms of particularly Hajj and also in Umrah. So, that's a constraint that you cannot really grow the traffic fully. And then what's the competition of Madinah as an airport compared to other airports, right? And as I said, Jeddah is the airport, which was a primary airport, which was processing these pilgrims. So what are the mitigants or the remedies that we sought? First of all, we found out that the religious motivation of the passengers is irrespective and insensitive to the external political economic factors. So particularly in the case of Umrah and Hajj, people will still go irrespective of what the condition of the country is. We came up with some parameters in terms of visa policy, and it was well defined in the bidding agreement. And if the government deviated from that, there were some provisions that allowed this to be a political event, which basically means there were remedies for the private sector. And then I think a no compete clause was also introduced in the BTO agreement. You basically said, if you have Madinah as a new airport, you will not have a competing airport within 200 kilometers radius of Madinah. And we came up with this 200 kilometer radius because we felt that, this is a distance that within this distance, people are able to take the car, right? And if you have another airport that will be competing with this directly, but if you have it outside of that, then it is protected from. The fourth risk was the investment risk. Is the duration of the contract enough for you to recover based on your traffic and demand of the airport? And do you have very rigid CapEx requirement in terms of building the airport and also expanding it? So first of all, based on our financial analysis and structuring, we thought that 25 years allowed you enough time to recover the investment and have a tail. Tail basically meaning that you pay the debt as well as you have some years so that you can go over any spikes in terms of traffic going down, etc. And then we basically were not prescriptive. We basically said we want to meet X number of KPIs, right? You do your own traffic forecasting, and based on that, propose an investment program. And in terms of future expansion, we basically linked it to the passenger growth, volumes, and service levels. So as I said, it was very output-based kind of a contract. We did not specify that we wanted a certain amount of space in the terminal. We just basically said as long as you meet certain KPIs, for instance, the space around the counters, for instance, the type of people that you can mix in the airport shouldn't really be very congested. Then you propose your own capital expenditure program. The next risk is revenue risk. This is around revenue collection. This is again fee collection, and this is around potential for commercial activities, right? And then you basically said you estimate this and you come up with a number which you are comfortable with, and bidders were required to propose a percentage share of their total gross revenues. And as I said, the winning bid was 54.5%, which we were very, very pleased with together with our client. The project company was also allowed to minimize its business risk when necessary. For instance, Saudi Arabian Airlines was not paying the airport at that time. And we were able to mitigate that risk by providing a guarantee from Ministry of Finance, so that if Saudi Arabia Airlines does not pay on time, then there's a trigger that Ministry of Finance can pay that guarantee. That is not to ensure that Saudi Arabian Airlines will just go scot-free. In return, what the Ministry of Finance did also was, if Saudi Arabian Airlines did not pay, it had an impact on the budget allocation of that airline from the Ministry of Finance. So it was balanced that way. And then we also included the commercial services in the airport, such as food and beverage, banking, rental cars, foreign exchange services, and that was completely non-regulated. We basically said, let the market dictate that, and let the private sector assess, collect that, and then that will automatically be included in the revenue share that they will quote as part of this bid parameters. Then we move on to operating risk. And operating risk, as I said, is mostly how are you able to operate the airport, right? What are the scope of activities that the government will do, and what are the scope of activities that the private sector will do, and who's going to manage the land side and the air side. So the way we structured that is the project company was responsible for managing, operating, and maintaining all aspects of the airport, whereas the grantor was only providing the essential services. This is the customs, the immigration services, and sometimes the military and security services. The next risk, as I said, is a shared risk. It's a force majeure risk. What happens if an unexpected event beyond the control of the parties occurs, right, or prevents the operations of the airport? First of all, I think in all the PPP projects, you look at what is an insurable risk. If it's insurable at a reasonable cost, you insure that, and usually that cost is borne by the private sector, but eventually by the public sector as well, because it's linked to the offer that is put on the table or the bid that the private sector puts on the table. There are some risks also which are non-insurable, and then the way we dealt with it was, if such a risk happens, we assess the impact of the risk, and then the concession agreement could be extended in length to allow for remedy of that as to be agreed with the government. And that is right now happening with the COVID-19 impact on the airport. And then I think finally, also, there was a termination guarantee. What happens if there's a prolonged event of force majeure, which basically means that the operation of the airport is not possible, and you still need to service the debt as a private sector. In that case, there is a termination event that happens, and the government guarantees provided. So, you put in $1 billion, $1.5 billion in terms of a capex. You need to make sure it's recovered as well. A black swan event could happen that basically meant that, or could mean that the airport is inoperable, right? For instance, there's a huge damage by an uninsurable event. In that case, the termination guarantee kicks in and the government makes good that payment. Finally, in summary, I would like to say that the basic process for allocating responsibilities and risks is, first of all, identification of the main risks and the main areas of responsibility in delivering these services, allocating these risks to the party who is best suited to do that. And then the last thing is design the arrangement to achieve this allocation of risk and responsibility. So allocate the risk that is for best suited to the party, which basically means the public sector risks go to the public sector. The risks that are more able to be mitigated by the private sector goes to the private sector. The shared risks are allocated as such. And this way you make a win-win project. And this was indeed a win-win project. Let me stop there. I went through this pretty quickly. I hope it was useful. And I'll be happy to answer any questions if there is a way of answering questions, either by chat or by someone raising their hands and coming up on screen. Otherwise, this presentation will be available to Newport Expo. Thanks very much.